Anti-Dühring. By Frederick Engels. 1877. Part 2. Political Economy. 2. Theory of Force. Quote, "In my system, the relation between general politics and the forms of economic law is determined in so definite a way and at the same time a way so original that it would not be superfluous, in order to facilitate study, to make special reference to this point. The formation of political relationships is historically the fundamental thing, and instances of economic dependence are only effects or special cases, and are consequently always facts of a second order. Some of the newer socialist systems take as their guiding principle the conspicuous semblance of a completely reverse relationship, in that they assume that political phenomena are subordinate to and, as it were, grow out of the economic conditions. It is true that these effects of the second order do exist as such, and are most clearly perceptible at the present time, but the primary must be sought in direct political force and not in any indirect economic power." End quote. This conception is also expressed in another passage, in which Herr Dühring quote, "starts from the principle that the political conditions are the decisive cause of the economic situation and that the reverse relationship represents only the reaction of a second order so long as the political grouping is not taken for its own sake, as the starting point, but is treated merely as a stomach-filling agency. One must have a portion of reaction stowed away in one's mind, however radical the socialist and revolutionary one may seem to be." End of quote. That is Herr Dühring's theory. In this and in many other passages it is simply set up, decreed, so to speak. Nowhere in the three fat tomes is there even the slightest attempt to prove it or to disprove the opposite point of view. And even if the arguments for it were as plentiful as blackberries, Herr Dühring would give us none of them. For the whole affair has been already proved through the famous original sin, when Robinson Crusoe made Friday his slave. That was an act of force, hence a political act. And inasmuch as this enslavement was the starting point and the basic fact underlying all past history and inoculated it with the original sin of injustice, so much so that in the later periods it was only softened down and quote-unquote transformed into the more indirect forms of economic dependence. And inasmuch as quote-unquote property founded on force which has asserted itself right up to the present day, is likewise based on this original act of enslavement, it is clear that all economic phenomena must be explained by political causes, that is, by force. And anyone who is not satisfied with that is a reactionary in disguise. We must first point out that only one with as much self-esteem as Herr Dühring could regard this view as so very original, which it is not in the least. The idea that political acts, grand performances of state, are decisive in history is as old as written history itself, and is the main reason why so little material has been preserved for us in regard to a really progressive evolution of the peoples which has taken place quietly, in the background, behind these noisy scenes on the stage. This idea dominated all the conceptions of historians in the past, and the first blow against it was delivered only by the French bourgeois historians of the Restoration period. Footnote 69. The only original thing about it is that Herr Dühring once again knows nothing of all this. Furthermore, even if we assume for a moment that Herr Dühring is right in saying that all past history can be traced back to the enslavement of man by man, we are still very far from having got to the bottom of the matter. For the question then arises, how did Crusoe come to enslave Friday? Just for the fun of it? By no means. On the contrary, we see that Friday is compelled to render economic service as a slave or as a mere tool and is maintained also only as a tool. Crusoe enslaved Friday only in order that Friday should work for Crusoe's benefit. And how could he derive any benefit for himself from Friday's labor? Only through Friday producing by his labor more of the necessaries of life than Crusoe has to give him to keep him fit to work. Crusoe, therefore, in violation of Herr Dühring's express orders, takes the political grouping arising out of Friday's enslavement not for its own sake, as the starting point, but merely as a stomach-filling agency, and now let him see to it that he gets along with his lord and master. Dühring, the childish example specially selected by Herr Dühring in order to prove that force is historically the fundamental thing, therefore, proves that force is only the means, and that the aim, on the contrary, is economic advantage. And the more fundamental the aim is than the means used to secure it, the more fundamental in history is the economic side of the relationship than the political side. The example therefore proves precisely the opposite of what it was supposed to prove. And as in the case of Crusoe and Friday, so in all cases of domination and subjection up to the present day, subjugation has always been, to use Herr Dühring's elegant expression, a stomach-filling agency, taking stomach-filling in a very wide sense, but never and nowhere a political grouping established for its own sake. It takes a Herr Dühring to be able to imagine that state taxes are only effects of a second order, or that the present-day political grouping of the ruling bourgeoisie and the rural proletariat has come into existence for its own sake and not as a stomach-filling agency for the ruling bourgeois, that is to say, for the sake of making profits and accumulating capital. However, let us get back again to our two men. Crusoe, sword in hand, makes Friday his slave. But in order to manage this, Crusoe needs something else besides his sword. Not everyone can make use of a slave. In order to be able to make use of a slave, one must possess two kinds of things: first, the instruments and material for his slave's labor, and secondly, the means of bare subsistence for him. Therefore, before slavery becomes possible, a certain level of production must already have been reached, and a certain inequality of distribution must already have appeared. And for slave labor to become the dominant mode of production in the whole of a society, an even far higher increase in production, trade and accumulation of wealth was essential. In the ancient primitive communities with common ownership of the land, slavery either did not exist at all or played only a very subordinate role. It was the same in the originally peasant city of Rome, but when Rome became a world city and Italic land ownership came more and more into the hands of a numerically small class of enormously rich proprietors, the peasant population was supplanted by a population of slaves. If at the time of the Persian Wars the number of slaves in Corinth rose to 460,000 and in China to 470,000, and there were 10 slaves to every freeman, footnote 70, something else besides force was required, namely, a highly developed arts and handicraft industry and an extensive commerce. Slavery in the United States of America was based far less on force than on the English cotton industry, in those districts where no cotton was grown, or which, unlike the border states, did not breed slaves for the cotton-growing states. It died out of itself without any force being used, simply because it did not pay. Hence, by calling property as it exists today property founded on force, and by characterizing it as, quote, that form of domination at the root of which lies not merely the exclusion of fellow men from the use of the natural means of subsistence, but also, what is far more important, the subjugation of man to make him do servile work, end quote. Herr Dühring is making the whole relationship stand on its head. The subjugation of a man to make him do servile work, in all its forms, presupposes that the subjugator has at his disposal the instruments of labor with the help of which alone he is able to employ the person placed in bondage, and in the case of slavery, in addition, the means of subsistence which enable him to keep his slave alive. In all cases, therefore, it presupposes the possession of a certain amount of property, in excess of the average. How did this property come into existence? In any case it is clear that it may in fact have been robbed, and therefore may be based on force, but that this is by no means necessary. It may have been got by labor, it may have been stolen, or it may have been obtained by trade or by fraud. In fact, it must have been obtained by labor before there was any possibility of its being robbed. Private property by no means makes its appearance in history as the result of robbery or force. On the contrary, it already existed, though limited to certain objects, in the ancient primitive communities of all civilized peoples. it developed into the form of commodities within these communities, at first through barter with foreigners. The more the products of the community assumed the commodity form, that is, the less they were produced for their producer's own use and the more for the purpose of exchange, and the more the original spontaneously evolved division of labor was superseded by exchange also within the community, the more did inequality develop in the property owned by the individual members of the community, the more deeply was the ancient common ownership of the land undermined, and the more rapidly did the commune develop towards its dissolution and transformation into a village of small-holding peasants. For thousands of years Oriental despotism and the changing rule of conquering nomad peoples were unable to endure these old communities. The gradual destruction of their primitive home industry by the competition of products of large-scale industry brought these communities nearer and nearer to dissolution. Force was as little involved in this process as in the dividing up, still taking place now, of the land held in common by the village communities Jehoferskafen on the Mosul and in the Hochwald. The peasants simply find it to their advantage that the private ownership of land should take the place of common ownership. Even the formation of a primitive aristocracy, as in the case of the Celts, the Germans and the Indian Punjab, took place on the basis of common ownership of the land, and at first was not based in any way on force, but on voluntariness and custom. Wherever private property evolved, it was a result of altered relations of production and exchange, in the interest of increased production and in furtherance of intercourse, hence as a result of economic causes. Force plays no part in this at all. Indeed, it is clear that the institution of private property must already be in existence for a robber to be able to appropriate another person's property, and that therefore force may be able to change the possession of, but cannot create, private property as such. Nor can we use either force or property founded on force in explanation of the subjugation of man to make him do servile work in its most modern form, wage labor. We have already mentioned a role played in the dissolution of the ancient communities, that is, in the direct or indirect general spread of private property, by the transformation of the products of labor into commodities, their production not for consumption by those who produced them, but for exchange. Now in Capital, Marx proved with absolute clarity, and Herr Dühring carefully avoids even the slightest reference to this, that at a certain stage of development, the production of commodities becomes transformed into capitalist production, and that at this stage the laws of appropriation or of private property, laws that are based on the production and circulation of commodities, become by their own inner and inexorable dialectic changed into their opposite. The exchange of equivalents, the original operation with which we started, has now become turned round in such a way that there is only an apparent exchange. This is owing to the fact, first, that the capital which is exchanged for labor power is itself but a portion of the product of others' labor appropriated without an equivalent, and, secondly, that this capital must not only be replaced by its producer, but replaced together with an added surplus. At first property seems to us to be based on a man's own labor. Now, however, at the end of Marx's analysis property turns out to be the right, on the part of the capitalist, to appropriate the unpaid labor of others, and to be the impossibility, on the part of the laborer, of appropriating his own product. The separation of property from labor has become the necessary consequence of a law that apparently originated in their identity. In other words, even if we exclude all possibility of robbery, force and fraud, even if we assume that all private property was originally based on the owner's own labor, and that throughout the whole subsequent process there was only exchange of equal values for equal values, the progressive development of production and exchange nevertheless brings us of necessity to the present capitalist mode of production, to the monopolization of the means of production and the means of subsistence in the hands of the one, numerically small, class, to the degradation into propertyless proletarians of the other class, constituting the immense majority, to the periodic alternation of speculative production booms and commercial crises, and to the whole of the present anarchy of production. The whole process can be explained by purely economic causes. At no point whatever are robbery, Force, the state or political interference of any kind necessary. Property founded on force proves here also to be nothing but the phrase of a braggart intended to cover up his lack of understanding of the real course of things. This course of things, expressed historically, is the history of the development of the bourgeoisie. If, political conditions are the decisive cause of the economic situation, then the modern bourgeoisie cannot have developed in struggle with feudalism, but must be the latter's voluntarily begotten pet child. Everyone knows that what took place was the opposite. Originally an oppressed estate liable to pay dues to the ruling feudal nobility, recruited from all manner of serfs and villains, the burghers conquered one position after another in their continuous struggle with the nobility, and finally, in the most highly developed countries, took power in its stead. In France, by directly overthrowing the nobility; in England, by making it more and more bourgeois and incorporating it as their own ornamental head. And how did they accomplish this? Simply through a change in the economic situation which sooner or later, voluntarily or as the outcome of combat, was followed by a change in the political conditions. The struggle of the bourgeoisie against the feudal nobility is the struggle of town against country, industry against landed property, money economy against natural economy, and the decisive weapon of the bourgeoisie in this struggle was its means of economic power, constantly increasing through the development of industry, first handicraft, and then, at a later stage, progressing to manufacture, and through the expansion of commerce. During the whole of this struggle political force was on the side of the nobility, except for a period when the crown played the bourgeoisie against the nobility, in order to keep one estate in check by means of the other. Footnote 71. But from the moment when the bourgeoisie, still politically powerless, began to grow dangerous owing to its increasing economic power, the crown resumed its alliance with the nobility, and by so doing called forth the bourgeois revolution, first in England and then in France. The political conditions in France had remained unaltered, while the economic situation had outgrown them. Judged by his political status the nobleman was everything, the burgher nothing. But judged by his social position the burgher now formed the most important class in the state, while the nobleman had been shorn of all his social functions and was now only drawing payment, in the revenues that came to him, for these functions which had disappeared. Nor was that all. Bourgeois production in its entirety was still hemmed in by the feudal political forms of the Middle Ages, which this production not only manufacture, but even handicraft industry had long outgrown. It had remained hemmed in by all the thousandfold guild privileges and local and provincial customs barriers which had become mere irritants and fetters on production. The bourgeois revolution put an end to this. Not, however, by adjusting the economic situation to suit the political conditions, in accordance with Herr Dühring's precept. This was precisely what the nobles and the crown had been vainly trying to do for years, but by doing the opposite, by casting aside the old mouldering political rubbish and creating political conditions in which the new economic situation could exist and develop. And in this political and legal atmosphere which was suited to its needs it developed brilliantly. So brilliantly that the bourgeoisie has already come close to occupying the position held by the nobility in 1789, it is becoming more and more not only socially superfluous, but a social hindrance. It is more and more becoming separated from productive activity, and, like the nobility in the past, becoming more and more a class merely drawing revenues, and it has accomplished this revolution in its own position and the creation of a new class, the proletariat, without any hocus-pocus of force whatever, in a purely economic way. Even more, it did not in any way will this result of its own actions and activities. On the contrary, this result established itself with irresistible force, against the will and contrary to the intentions of the bourgeoisie. Its own productive forces have grown beyond its control, and, as if necessitated by a law of nature, are driving the whole of bourgeois society towards ruin, or revolution. and if the bourgeois now make their appeal to force in order to save the collapsing economic situation from the final crash, this only shows that they are laboring under the same delusion as Herr Dühring, the delusion that political conditions are the decisive cause of the economic situation. This only shows that they imagine, just as Herr Dühring does, that by making use of the direct political force they can remodel those facts of the second order of dph. 538 the economic situation and its inevitable development, and that therefore the economic consequences of the steam engine and the modern machinery driven by it, of world trade and the banking and credit developments of the present day, can be blown out of existence by them with Krupp guns and Mauser rifles. Footnote 72